Milling Through History presents Fingerprinting a Nation. When we think about fingerprints when it comes to criminal investigation, there's certainly no lack of excitement to it. In fact, people are always amazed at the fact that on their hands is a unique set of lines that can only be found on them. Nobody else can have the very same fingerprint that you have. And so every year, parents like to sometimes go and have their children fingerprinted for, just child safety records. And this makes a huge difference, especially when you're trying to find children. It's a quick, easy way to be done. When babies are born, they will have their footprints done because, again, much like a fingerprint, the footprint is uniquely only attached to one child. And so when we think about this particular thing, you have to imagine, well, why haven't the police used this since the very beginning? Well, the answer is that nobody actually thought fingerprints were worthwhile. Early detectives thought, well, we do our investigation, we're going to track down the killers, we're going to find them, or we'll track down the thieves, we'll find them and bring them to justice. And yet sometimes the lack of evidence meant that many individuals who were oftentimes innocent would be put away for crimes they never committed. And yet, it wasn't until the year 1892 that the value of fingerprinting would occur. Now, you might say to yourself, all right, so where was it in the United States that fingerprinting was proven to be accurate? It wasn't in the United States. All right, it has to be in Europe then. It wasn't in Europe. Well, then where was it? Answer, Argentina. The story itself takes place just outside of Buenos Aires, and there was a shocking discovery of a woman by the name of Francisca Rojas and her children who were severely injured in an attack. Now, when everyone was found, the children had passed away from their wounds. Meanwhile, their mother had survived. According to Francisca, a neighbor whose name was Pedro Ramon Velasquez had attacked her after feeling he had been slighted by her. The two had been together as a couple, and now they were no longer together. Now, when Velasquez was arrested, he continuously denied that he was responsible for the attack and the deaths of the children. His defense was that he was with a friend at the time, and therefore was nowhere near the scene of the crime. Well, the local police would do their own investigation, but they just couldn't prove that Velasquez was at the scene of the crime. And yet, Francisca Rojas said he was there. He did it. He's a criminal. Arrest him, put him in jail, sentence him to death. And so the police needed to get some help. And they would do so. They would contact Inspector Eduardo Alvarez, and he was brought in to investigate the crime. Now, while doing this particular investigation, Alvarez would discover a bloody fingerprint on the door. And this was his first clue that said something was wrong with this case, because why would there be a bloody fingerprint from the perpetrator? Obviously, if Velasquez didn't do it, he wouldn't leave any evidence to prove he did it. In fact, it seemed rather peculiar. And so Alvarez decided he would need to ask an expert, and he had one, a friend of his by the name of Juan Vucetich. Now, Vucetich was interested in fingerprints and cataloging the entire population of Argentina in order to help solve crimes. He had found that fingerprinting was probably the most useful way in determining the truth of a situation, especially if you knew how to dust for fingerprints and how to carefully investigate a scene. And so, Alvarez would cut out the fingerprint and send it to his friend. And Vucetich would find that the fingerprints that from this bloody piece of wall did not match those of Pedro Velasquez, but it did match those of Francisca Rojas. Now, this led the police to believe that Rojas was integral and part of this crime. After being confronted with the evidence, Rojas did confess that she had a different lover who had been with her, and he did not like her children. In fact, he said flat out he would no longer be with her as long as the children were around. And so, he made demands that she get rid of them. In order to prevent anyone from ever suspecting her and killing her own children, she immediately blamed Velasquez, her neighbor and friend, who really had never the worst thing he had ever done to her was basically be nice to her. And so, the success of using fingerprints to identify a criminal impressed the Argentine police so much that they congratulated Vucetich on using such a novel approach to solving a crime. When it was proposed that the entire population of Argentina should be fingerprinted for a database, this particular proposal was met with an immediate lack of trust and immediate no's as well. It's not as if it was going to be a very easy task to fingerprint every single citizen in the nation. However, the movement to do this would continue, and even after Vucetich had died, Argentina would eventually adopt the technique of using fingerprints before the rest of the world, and by the 1980s had already begun a database of having every citizen in the nation being fingerprinted. It would not be until the 20th century before the United States, Great Britain, and other more notable nations of the world would also begin to adopt and use the principle of fingerprinting. For more information, please consider these suggested titles. Be sure to click on the left-hand side of the screen to subscribe to our show, and on the right-hand side for our latest episode. And we will see you again for the next episode of Milling Through History.